There will be a lot of
Right.
CrossFitters who will be listening. There will also be some powerlifters, some weightlifters, and some endurance athletes as well. But
Right.
I would be interested to hear if you could give an explanation of what are the typical injuries and why that you see them with CrossFit, your assessment of the injury to methodology relationship.
Yeah, well, it's a fabulous question, but injuries cluster around specific sports and specific training methods. And there's a reason for it. It's the chronic exposure. So physical exposure to the body causes adaptations. Now, that adaptation can be good or it can be bad, but you load the body and the body will adapt. So that's the beginning opening principle. If you go back to that T Nation article, I think it was in the title of the first paragraph, I have a love-hate relationship with CrossFit. I mean, I absolutely love CrossFit for the culture, for the supportive community. I love it. If I was younger, I would have been in there 100%. But now let's get into the biological adaptation, and then I can give you a solution. So CrossFit combines adaptations to stimulate mobility, and then the next exercise is asking you to have a tougher collagen. Let me give you an example. So if you start out a routine with 10 burpees, you are creating high mobility in the back without much load. So burpees on their own are probably not going to create too much challenge to the adaptation process. You're teaching the spine to be a bit more mobile, but it doesn't pay the price because there's no load. Then the next routine is repeated Olympic lifts. Now we have a problem. There's no margin for bad form. So CrossFit tries to create an endurable athlete, a power athlete, and a mobile athlete. That's very, very difficult to do in terms of biological adaptations. So by programming 10 Olympic lifts, you know the form is going to deteriorate. Now you're migrating stress. The first 2 reps might be all right. And interestingly enough, I don't get many Olympic lifters in as back pain patients. They have to go and see the knee and shoulder guys. Those are the joints that the Olympic lifters are having trouble with. Not really. They've got quite healthy low backs.
And they'll be very stiff.
Well, they lock them into much more of a neutral position because the mobility is at the hips. And they're actually a speed power athlete. They're very, very quick. They have good pulsing on and off. They relax to catch the bar and the snatch and all of these kinds of things. But let's get back to the CrossFit programming. The first 2 lifts might be fine. The third one now, you're starting to get a little bit tired. You're polluting the perfect movement muscle memory of an Olympic lift. So do you see, to be a great Olympic lifter, you would never pollute it when you're tired. But CrossFit's a different sport. It is an endurance. And look, I get the sport. There's lots of sports that aren't necessarily the best for your long-term athleticism. That's just, I have a lot of MMA athletes. I don't think that's a particularly healthy thing to do for your body. But it's a sport nonetheless, and they come to me asking for help. So, of course, I get CrossFit athletes as well, and it's my job to try and adapt their body to be resilient, but we have to make a compromise here. But that's the nature of the programming. So somewhere you have to be between stiffening the spine collagen through repeated load exposures, heavy load exposures, but you can't move your back. That's the difference. So on rep 1 and 2, you might be fine on the Olympic lift, but rep 8, 9, and 10 are pretty not very nice in terms of the bending stresses. And it's at that point where things fall off the rails in terms of biological adaptations, and the collagen the fibers not the fibers necessarily, but the ground substance between them start to loosen up. And the fact of the matter is the nucleus will slowly work its way through the delaminating collagen and get a disc bulge. So every sport has its pattern, shall we say, and that certainly is. Now, if I could offer this, and I think in that article, I did offer a solution at the end, and it comes from, let's take the good things from CrossFit and mitigate the things that are not so good in terms of biological adaptation. And Dan John, have you ever heard of Dan John?
No.
Out of the U.S.?
No.
They call him the quirky uncle or something of training. He's a fabulous fella. We're both the same age. We're both in our middle 60s. We have somewhat of the same background and whatnot. But Dan is a really wise guy, and he's very clever in that he can say magnificent things in just a few words. But Dan's solution to the burpee Olympic lift routine would be to do kettlebell swings with a goblet squat, for example. Okay. So there would be a wonderful substitute in a CrossFit program to mitigate the biological adaptations that are going to lead to tissue breakdown. Isn't that an interesting one to think about? So from a biological adaptation point of view, both of those involve a hip hinge. They involve strength, endurance, and they're telling the body to adapt in a consistent way, which is not so with burpees and Olympic lifts. Anyway, there's just a thought for you. But you mentioned other athletes as well, like powerlifters, for example. They have a slightly different cluster of patterns for back injury, but generally speaking, they too begin with end plate fractures and Schmorl's nodes. But here's the difference. Let's take bodybuilding, where you train on Monday to tear down muscle at the micro level. Tuesday, you rebuild the muscle in the kitchen and in bed. In other words, while you're resting. And Wednesday, you go again and you repeat the process. Powerlifters, when you examine, and I've worked with some of the grand old women and grand old men of powerlifting, the very successful ones, the CrossFitters would consider them undertrained, because a very heavy, strong powerlifter might do heavy squats on Mondays and take 5 days off. In other words, they allowed all the microfracturing this is at the micro level now, down at the level of the bone osteons or the bone cells. They are damaged, there's no question. But is that damage a good thing or a bad thing? For a CrossFitter, it would be a bad thing, because the CrossFitter says, oh, on my day off, I only ran 5K. Wait a second, that's not a day off. That's more cumulative. So it's crazy to keep stimulating the body to adapt, and then you don't take the day off to allow the adaptation. But the powerlifter has a much more wise biological adaptation schedule. They'll do heavy squats or say it's a pull from the ground, a deadlift, for example, and then they take 5 days off. Now let's discuss the adaptation of bone. Bone is a piezoelectric material, and what that means is when you stress a bone, it builds an electric charge. That electric charge attracts free ions of calcium and magnesium, and it glues it, or it chemically bonds it to where the fracture is, or the high stress. But it takes 5 days for those new ions of basic bone building material, calcium, magnesium, and whatnot, to scaffold on before they break it off again. But what does the CrossFitter do? They train the next day and they break off the adaptation that they were trying to create. So do you see the same micro damage in a powerlifter is a good thing? It stimulated adaptation, but they were wise enough to let the biology over the next 5 days really build substantial bone strength. That's not typically the way a CrossFitter would train. It's just more is better, and they don't allow sufficient adaptation. So these are all very interesting philosophical things to discuss in terms of creating robustness to load and better athletic performance. But, I get it. I get CrossFit. I get why you do it. As I said, I would have been there if it was 40 years ago as well.
Yeah.
However, I've learned quite a bit about biology in the meantime. And that's why the training, it may not be so much the poor exercises sometimes. It may just be the not paying enough attention to the adaptation schedules of some of these things. And, that's just pure programming. So any organization could change their programming and create a more robust athlete.